Well, we'll just get into my questions and see what happens and see where the spirit moves. Why not? But I do want you to begin just by introducing yourself and telling us who you are.
Well, which persona are you talking about? I mean, I've got about 15.
What feels most, what feels most authentic or present to you right now that you would want people to know about you?
Okay. The most important thing right now is that I'm a parent in a pandemic. And that role is the most powerful one. And then I became a parent in the face of Black Lives Matter protests with 2 children who are perceived as African American but are biracial. And then how all those things are sort of coming together to shape this moment for me in terms of how to navigate these novel spaces that none of us, not one of us, has lived through before in any kind of meaningful way. So that's the primacy of that identity. And of course, 12 weeks ago, I would have had a completely different response and a different place of starting. But that has been absolutely, totally dominant. The fact that there are dinner tables to have these kinds of conversations on a routine basis is something that is also much more clearly a part of who I am right now. But the professional pieces, I'm a professor of practice at University of San Diego. I'm also the director of the leadership development arm of the Nonprofit Institute. Both are in the School of Leadership and Education Sciences, so that's what I do. I'm a psychologist by training. And because I'm a psychologist by training, I have worked with individuals and organizations for the better part of 3 decades now. And so a lot of what I do is informed by that. And the other part that is the major piece of where this particular piece came from is that I work with young advocates and activists in an organization called Rise San Diego. And it's an urban leadership fellows program where I'm the director of that faculty. And the young people that I work with are primarily, well, quite honestly, they were some of the people that were leading the unrest in the last few weeks. And I have other people who are on the edge of the environmental movement and how COVID exposed so much of what was going on in terms of the planet's degradation, and how those 2 issues now just dovetail with each other. And they were very much alive and well in me.
Beautiful. Thank you. Just a couple things I noticed, which were, is how the way you describe yourself is so contextual. And I think that's really important, right? Like how I'm introducing myself now is very different than how I would have introduced myself a few weeks ago. And I love that that's how you introduced yourself because of the contextual nature of your piece. It's also what as a pastor, what I'm pushing for with scripture, right? How do we read it in the context in which it was written, which is so important. So thank you for that. And also the other thing I noticed is the intersections, how those wove together in your, which is what I love about your piece too, which we'll get into. But I'm just so grateful that you're here and that you're you and that you are willing to have this conversation today. So here's where I'm hoping that we can start a little bit. I just want to hear, first of all, how do you define this piece that you wrote? Is it an essay? Is it a poem? I've been calling it a psalm. How would you define that? And can you tell me just what was the process like for you writing it?
It is something that I call a tone poem essay, which is a fancy way of saying it's a hybrid between most of the essays that I write and the poetry that I write. But it began to take on the sort of rhythm and meter and flow of my poetry but it wanted to be written as an essay, and the two voices, if you will, decided that no, we're going to work together on this one. The process of writing this one was interesting because the line, "A Reckoning is Coming," came to me probably 8 weeks ago. And it primarily came out of the rate and pace at which we were reopening society, and the protests that were going on, specifically in Michigan, with the white nationalists. I won't call them supremacists, they're nationalists, but I would change that language now. And the confrontation there. And when Georgia opened, and then the disproportionate outcomes that we're finding in terms of COVID infections and deaths. And so all of those things were coming together to say, wait a minute, we're having an impact on people where they're basically expendable. And what we were learning about the climate and the changes over major cities when all of people were under quarantine, that the air was getting clearer, and and so wildlife was coming closer to cities and things of that sort. So all of that was something that we saw concurrently. So that was pretty exciting. So then what I would do is that I go on a walk every day, try to do my 10,000 steps. And then the rhythm of the piece began to arrive. And then one day I was on a walk and I had just begun to wear earphones with the speaker on it. And I said, let me try this. And then I began to speak to it. And that was the first piece of it. It arrived. And then what happened is that then we had Ahmaud Arbery, then we had Breonna Taylor, then we had George Floyd, and then the piece came together. Then it was just one expression of all of this pandemic protest moment that just wanted to be spoken. And I woke up one morning and I just kept writing until it was complete.
That's just, you make it sound like it just like emerged through you.
Yes. The strongest pieces that I write are of that form. I learned this early in the poetry process, was that a poem would arrive, and that if I had a pen, if I would get it, I would be able to catch it before it disappeared. But otherwise, yeah, I think it would just go to somebody else, and some other poet has it in their collection now. So I learned that in terms of the poet self. And then what COVID presented was that the writer, poet, essayist also began to do that, because the first piece that I wrote during COVID was a whole mapping of the stages of development in the pandemic in the first week. And I said, how would you be able to do that? Well, not only was I able to write it, I've been doing webinars literally around the world, virtually, on it, because it was really an important heuristic in terms of how we might understand this. So I began to trust that this voice, which is not my voice, I believe it is the voice that is embodied through me, that I become this vessel for it. And then I try to be as faithful up to it when I can, when I'm not emotionally and physically exhausted.
Right. I think it was Elizabeth Gilbert. I'm trying to remember who it was. Someone has a TED Talk on how this idea of genius. Have you heard this? When it was originally created, genius was not a person. It's something outside of you. And when you write something that's inspired, you would say the genius was with you. And so it's kind of like what you're saying. It's this thing floating around and it's with you. I would say more the spirit, right? Because of course I'm going to put it in churchy.
Yeah, of course you do.
Right.
One of my personae would also put it that way as well.
Okay. Nice.
So the old lay preacher wanted to be an Episcopal priest part of me would also say the same thing.
I love it. That's got to be a conversation for another service. We'll have to have. That's great. So it's really interesting to me, though, that it feels like this piece started as spoken word almost. I mean,
it was literally spoken word in the sense that I recorded it. as I was,
Not almost. It was literally spoken.
literally a spoken word piece. And I imagine that I do have spoken word artists who are among the fellows with whom I work, and there are one or two of their voices that I've heard doing the pieces where they would be able to get into the full resonance and the rhythm of it and really punctuate the alliteration in ways that I'm not skilled to do. But yes, it really is. Ultimately, I think it is a spoken word piece, and I think that there are aspects of it that I don't even know because I'm I'm the writer of it, but I'm not the owner of it. Let's put it that way.
And I love how you called yourself the vessel. I think that the writer, not the owner. That's beautiful. Okay, so what I'm wondering, I kind of mentioned this a little bit at the beginning, is that one of the things that really inspired me about that poem was the intersectionality in it of the current world that we're existing in. And to me, it felt like it was a weaving of these truths and these realities that we are living in. So can you just talk a little bit about that weaving together of Black Lives Matter, of the environment, of COVID, of those things that exist in this piece?
Absolutely. One of the things that I believe, to the degree that a pandemic can be a gift, is that it has allowed for the opportunity for deep internal reflection if you are available to it. That's the first thing. The second thing, it revealed very strongly early on the impact that human activity, irrespective of how you feel about this science of climate change, that human activity was having on the planet and on wildlife. Then, once we began to know the outcomes of the pandemic, that people who were poor and people who, in this national context, are people of color, that it was hitting these populations. And there was something about the structural and systemic aspects of how we've set up this whole thing that then began to trouble me. And trouble would be a nice word for it. I really it was kind of like softly enraged by how we had collectively created the circumstance whereby we were colluding together to harm the planet and the life on the planet, our forms of life that we're familiar with, that we were colluding together to assure that the most impoverished people and people who tended to be oppressed also had to carry the burden of a virus for which we have no cure yet. And so when those things began to come together, then it made me wonder about then how are all these different ways that we aren't confronting it, and what are the messages from it. And then the part of me that is indeed a priest wannabe kind of came out. And so when I posted this at LinkedIn, I said it is in the voice of Zachariah as opposed to Zachary. So it's almost as if it's not John the Baptist's father, but the old school Zachariah that was really here.
Love that clarification. Yes.
Yeah. And so and he, all these he was kind of really kind of like yell at folks kind of prophet. So yeah, he kind of showed up.
I love it. I love it. He kind of showed up. That's beautiful. I think that's really beautiful. And I think I often wonder about how good we've become at compartmentalizing pieces of our lives. And so I think sometimes we don't allow things to come together because it would be too overwhelming, or, how could we continue on with the weight of the world in that way? But I thought that's one of the reasons I love this piece. It's like those are all things that my community is passionate about. Climate change, Black Lives Matter, we helping those whom society values the least. All of those things are things that we are passionate about, but it's hard to put them in conversation with each other sometimes. People like to make them fight each other instead of work together.
Well, I think that's one of the challenges is that we all sort of begin to operate from that space, that we have a preferred element of that overall narrative, and we tend to stay in that lane. And then when they are come in contact with each other, it's like that old movie Crash, because it's like they crash into each other. And then social media, of course, then plays into the sort of bubbles in which we all live at this point. And so therefore, we're not even accustomed to holding courageous conversations with each other about these differences, and everything is reduced to a meme or soundbite. And therefore, the nuance of what you have to say may actually overlap much more than the positionality that we've learned to express.
That's a beautiful way to put it. Yes. That leads me into one of the sections of this piece that I really like is, I'll just read it to you, which feels weird because you're the writer of it, but
Here it sounds, yes.
is the stewardship becomes brinkmanship absent leadership. We take the path over the knife's edge into killing the unarmed, calling upon our authorities to enact our hatred, communicating that some lives really do not matter. Once more creating an inevitable, inequitable enslavement of dependable, expendable life. We wash our hands clean, sanitized, as the asymptomatic, unwitting carriers of a perpetuated virus of silence as violence.
Ooh, I like that section too.
I love that section. That is like so inspired. Oh, and let me include the next part of it because I think that speaks to it too. We play party into polarities that evoke an angry inertia in social media gone mad, grabbing clickbait to negate and palliate the denied pain, mistaking impotent passivism for actual advocacy and activism. A reckoning is coming. So you just talked about that a little bit with social media. I want to take this apart a little bit.
Do your thing, Megan.
Man, I'm so glad we know each other.
Yeah, I've heard your sermons. Yeah, break it down.
I know. But I mean, well, there's so much to unpack, right? Your use of language is just, I mean, it is inspired. It's beautiful. But I want to hear you talk a little bit about this inevitable, inequitable enslavement of dependable, expendable life. Wow.
Well, it was that line ultimately was inspired by a lot of work that I've been doing, changing the language from slavery to enslavement.
Yes.
Which is not just about political correctness, but when I went to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, that was the first thing that they educate you about, is that, you know, slavery and enslavement are different constructs. So that was the first. And then a friend of mine is working a lot with the language around post-traumatic slavery syndrome. And the idea of that is that we as property historically is still something that is carried forward at least at a collective unconscious level. And then the enactment of that then leads to this sense that anytime a Black person then responds in a way that is inconsistent with that, then there's a reminder that the life is expendable and that the life does not matter, because it's actually not a human life, it's basically just property. And so then this kind of thinking is then perpetuated because we have leadership, especially leadership at the national level right now, that allows for that narrative to be unleashed in such a way that it is applauded, literally. And so when you have these two things then that come together, then you create the conditions that we have right now of extreme polarities around this, because there's a wish for and a fantasy that that way of being was some kind of way okay. And that the way that is emerging is somehow an anathema to that. Of course it is, if you prefer it that way. And then what begins to happen is then you get into our polarity bubbles in social media, and that then perpetuates itself, and we just stay in these cycles. And so it is a lot of movement, but ultimately it's moving nowhere. So that's why the word of inertia is in it, because it doesn't really propel the discourse in any kind of direction that allows us to break the chains of this this enslavement that now has us all.
Yes. And like we're all preaching to our own choirs.
Absolutely. Totally.
Yes, exactly. Could you just unpack a little bit? Just, I want to be sure that my
Mhm.
community understands the enslavement, the importance of that switching of language to use
Yeah.
enslavement.
Like to call a person who was brought from their homeland to another land a slave then emphasizes the notion of property. And so then if I think of myself as being a slave, then I am also taking in the process that I am this property. But enslavement is an action of oppression that
Yes.
is done to another human being, which is a very different kind of thing. So the agency is actually on the part of the persons who are participated in this oppressive, discriminatory, denigrating behavior. Where there's a sort of a degradation of human life in that respect. So it is a really very important distinction that, wow, as I speak to it, I can sort of feel the shift in language and what it creates accordingly.
Yes, thank you. I think it's a really important distinction that we all need to begin embracing in our language, for exactly the reason you just named. Great. Can you talk about this mistaking impotent passivism for actual advocacy and activism?
Oh, yes.
Did you know I was going to ask you about that?
You see, this is the one that I know annoys people, because in between COVID and the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter moment and protests, people are looking for something to be able to do. And so the social media posts that people are making, the ownership of whiteness and privilege, the recognition of the disproportionate outcomes, providing those data with each other, that is actually very important. So I don't want to negate it. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to say it.
Just say it.
But what it does, though, is it is done in part, not exclusively, but in part because it gives the illusion of a true empathy, and it's not actual empathy. It's performative and not transformative, and that's the language that a lot of people are using right now. The difference, performative empathy is also as much about ego as it is about the person or people for whom you are showing this expression of feeling. And then performative empathy is actually no more than good old sympathy. Oh, you poor people, I'm sorry that you're experiencing that. Transformative empathy is then actually doing things that are going to fundamentally challenge the discourse, the status quo, the power structures. And that way you really have some skin in the game. And so the sort of passivism, and that's the language that I've written about previously, is that space between simply saying, like on Facebook or Instagram or on your Twitter feed, and writing the check, educating friends, being in an uncomfortable conversation. That's great, but it isn't the same as actual activism, where one is fully engaged with the people whose lives are actually literally on the line in many of these cases. And so that sort of pivot spot is what I'm trying to describe for people. And let me finish this. Okay, the challenge of that pivot spot is that once you sort of cross that threshold, it's like the language that the young people use now. You can't unsee it.
Hmm.
And then from that point on, then you have to sort of recognize that you're in it for the rest of your life. And if you do pretend that you don't see it, then it creates a sort of regressive anxiety. Went all psychologists there for a second, but it does create a regressive anxiety because you're pushing this away. You're regressing to an earlier aspect of yourself that didn't know this, and then you have to actively repress this consciousness, and that doesn't work. It just does not work. And so I understand where people sort of stop on that knife's edge, because if you cross over, then
you can't go back.
You can't. You really cannot. Not truly.
Mm-hmm. So what does I mean, a lot of people, right, are just beginning their journeys right now with understanding race and racism, and I want to be encouraging of that, not shaming of that. That's important for me because a part of my job, right, is going to be to bring people along. And I wonder, though, I'm being, very encouraging of people who are reading and educating themselves and writing the checks and, doing all those things. But how could people begin that pivot that you're talking about? I mean, how do you start that real activism?
I want to first start with where you started, is that the education, the financial support, those kinds of steps are developmentally absolutely key steps, because absent those, then you really are not even able to enter the conversation. So please do not hear me saying, stop writing checks and don't read books. Okay, it's quite the opposite. Both of those are key. But I will let you know that some of my activist friends will spew lava at such efforts because they experience them as too slow, too late, too disingenuous. Okay, so then the reactivity that my young activist colleagues will have around that, it creates a recoil, and I understand that as well. So let me try to get to this. So developmentally, it does begin with the education of oneself. One hopes that one does not encounter a situation where in your efforts, then you are rebuffed, because then it makes it difficult to continue the conversation. But then that gets to the next piece is that when one sort of owns the construct of whiteness, owns the construct of privilege, that's sort of like an intermediary step. And in that intermediary step, you can sort of recognize that in your family, if you have a teenage boy, you don't have to ever have the talk with him about the potential danger of being belligerent in the face of state authority, because that could cost you your life. It's not a conversation that's necessary. There isn't a necessary conversation to say that your skin color is going to evoke a set of projections onto you that have nothing to do with the content of your character, to do Martin Luther King for a moment there. And that you have to be able to see that and notice that, so that there's a vigilance. Okay, so the naming of privilege is to recognize that there are people who do have that experience, and to not negate or to question that reality, because from a personal perspective, intergenerational perspective, historical perspective, those traumas are inherent and repeated. Okay, so that's the next part. So if that can be held, then it's okay. But then The next level is the actual entry into the real conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And then in that conversation, there are two things that invariably happen. There's a sort of a shock and dismay, which then looks like a denial.
Mm-hmm.
And then that is just going to, let us say, not be met well. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
The other part is the fragility and the woundedness that the well-intentioned performative empathy is not accepted with open arms and gratitude. And then these two situations that unconsciously deny the experience of people who have histories of oppression, and the other part of needing to be taken care of in
Mm-hmm.
the face of the other person's story, then creates a dynamic where my young activist friends in particular said, I don't even want to be bothered with that. I don't have time for that. Now, if one can tolerate that moment, then we're ready for what I am working on a piece called Advanced Allyship.
Mm.
Okay, and so this is fresh, so and new. Advanced allyship is the ownership of the ways that one is complicit in supremacist ideology
Mm-hmm.
and thought, word, and deed. They are the small ways that one locks one's car really quickly because that person may just be one of those.
Yeah.
Okay. It is that part of you that recoils just with the blink of an eye in the face of another. It is the part that finds yourself saying, "Oh, I wouldn't go there at night," and even in your head, it is in that professional context when someone like me is seen, and like the first day that I go to do the major lecture in a required course in a doctoral program, and I'm standing in front and I'm wearing the jacket and tie, and one of the students turns to me and says, "Excuse me, when will the professor be coming in?"
Mm.
So these sort of micro aggressions is the language that's used for it, but I'm not talking simply about the level of the microaggression. I'm talking about the examination of one's propensity to have these things so hardwired in oneself
Mm-hmm.
that you own them and recognize them. And since most people have these hardwired throughout life, the disentanglement from one's own functioning is the next level. And then, so it isn't about an ongoing confessional about this. It's sort of like owning that it's there,
Mm-hmm.
okay, and recognizing that you're going to do it. And that means that you're going to step in it over and over again. It's inherent. And so that's part of the advanced part. The other part of the advanced part is to look at the subtle ways in which the supremacy shows up in the speaking for, in the savior syndrome, in the enactments of hierarchy, hegemony in various forms that you don't even notice. I'll give you an example. I was invited to an international panel during this
Mm-hmm.
whole thing on my first paper, which is on mapping the stages of the response to COVID. And I won't name the organization, but I was invited to this panel. And then the two things happened. One, I wanted a poll question, but I used language in such a way that it allowed for the potential of a number of responses. And so the moderator wrote me back and said, "I'm not sure about the verb choice." And then I had to write a letter back about my verb choice and point out, that my fifth grade English teacher thought that was okay. And then the person sort of stepped back and recognized that. The second thing is that when the panel was meeting to prepare for the event, they said, "Well, we would like to upload all of the papers." And so the panelist colleague, rather than say, allow me the opportunity to say, I'll send my paper, no problem. I have this paper, and I will send in the paper for him. And so it was such a subtlety. And people, well, so what? She was concerned that about your but this is twice around something where it was my work, it was my responsibility, and there was an implicit questioning of my capacity to write an adequate question and to be able to provide my own material to the conveners of this. And people, I'm sure you're saying, there's a hypersensitivity to that. If you are saying there's a hypersensitivity to that, then that is exactly the issue that I'm describing, is the fact that I have any vigilance around that and that I'm concerned about that is something that people who do not have my privilege in terms of education and background walk around with disproportionately 10 times, 100 times more than I'm even expressing right now. That I'm expressing right now. And that's the part that's key. So if that was the reaction to what I am saying, then the person that you do see walking down the street that you are with whom you have no familiarity is experiencing that in an even more pronounced way. And so the young people that are showing up in the streets blocking the I-5 are speaking to that. And that's what they're trying to say. I have no other way of saying this. So if I can inconvenience you for an hour, then you know what it's like when I feel inconvenienced this way my entire life. Okay.
Thank you. Yes. And well, one of the things I want to touch on that my husband keeps saying, which I think is important, in use of that term ally, because I know like good white progressives, we love to try to be allies. And my husband keeps saying being an ally is like being on a journey of faith. It's a journey of being an ally. You never arrive. You're not an ally. You don't get to put that on your business card. It is like you are always trying to practice that. And we all have so much to learn about what that looks like as white people. You don't arrive, even if you've done the work. Is the challenging people. It's like, I'm not the most faithful because I went to seminary. It's like that, it's so hard. But thank you for your explanation. And just for the way that your vulnerability and sharing pieces of your story. I really appreciate that and want to honor that. So thank you. One more thing, and then I'll let you go. But
we'll see.
You make a shift towards hope at the end. And I was like, really? I mean, that was tell me about it. Tell me about that shift.
I wanted people to read the piece.
That is an answer. Wow.
Okay. And I wanted people to share the piece. And, a couple thousand people have read it. And for my essays, that's usually between 2,000 and 5,000 people read my better essays. So that's fine for me. I'm not looking to go viral. I'm looking for it to be in places and spaces where it influences thought. And so I know that a major development organization, a ministry of another country, a major university in the UK have picked this up. So then that's really what I like. And despite what I said about my experience with the international panel, that the international panel even picked up my first paper in the COVID series, is amazing. And then what must have meant for them to have the risk of having me on, because I'm sure very few people of my demographic are there. So that's the first part, is that it wasn't like, ooh, let's have people read it, so let's add hope. But the other part is, then I said, if I only connect to the sort of the darkness and the shadow of this, the cynicism and the doubt, then I am perpetuating a process that is another form of the exact polarization to which I alluded. So that's the first part. The second part is then I just thought about the myth of the Pandora's box. Because what we forget about in the myth of the Pandora's box is that the last thing that comes out is hope. And so I said, okay, then let us do an allusion to that, a sort of a soft allusion to that amid all of these things that really are a source of potential reckoning, and a part of what, Revelations has warned us about, then let us also hope that there's some form of salvation. And I don't mean that only in the Christian sense of salvation, but there's salvation in which a faithfulness to what God has given us in terms of my favorite line, which the difference between domination and dominion, that we really are here and given this capacity to anticipate what our lives could be, that we're given this. It is a true gift. Then let us be faithful stewards in that kind of way. And so I want to invite all of us to consider that. Me, if I had written this thing, I would have just stopped. Reckoning coming.
Done.
With the gun. But I had to be a good and faithful servant. and so some words of hope and some direction of what that hope might be also emerged. Yes.
Do you have hope?
Personally, I'm of an age where not in my lifetime. I made that pivot about 10 years ago. That the way that I see it is that there is such a powerful need for the racial discourse to be as it is, because got another 20 or 30 years of that not being able to shift because the people who are currently in power gain too much benefit from it, and there's really not sufficient incentive to shift it. And they were also not brought up in circumstances where they have been familiar with through media, art, music, and personal experience that challenges that in any kind of way. I mean, the data are clear. 75% of white folks do not have a Black friend. Okay, so, okay. And then we also know the data that in a lot of parts of the country, you really only have circles of people who also are in the same circumstance. So that becomes mutually reinforcing. So there's not really a lot of potential shift for that. The other part is that our political and economic systems are set up in such a way that the exploitation of humans and the exploitation of the planet are necessary to create sufficient profit. Yeah. And so the likelihood of that shifting, because one of the few international languages we have is the economic language of what the markets do. And so there is very little incentive to talk about that, because after a hurricane, we talk about the billions of dollars that will be need to replace, as opposed to the countless sources of misery that happen in human life. And so what we report on and what we value are in those kinds of ways still so strongly embedded. So I have absolutely no hope of that changing in my lifetime. I have hope that the next generation, and it's not to put it on them, but by virtue of the fact that the coalitions that we're seeing around the Black Lives Matter movement marches right now are unlike anything that I've seen since the 60s. Okay, and I was asking one of my friends who's of a similar age to me, you know, who are all these white people? And then she said, "Oh, these are the new hippies." And I said, "Ah, so it's the Panthers and the hippies together again." Yes, okay. And I said, okay. So, but I mean that also very seriously in terms of almost 50 years, 60 years after the fact, that there is yet another generation of young people who have this kind of hope, who have this kind of experience of one another, and who have the possibility of sparking on the kinds of liberations that did indeed make a difference in the lives of African American people, of women, of gay and lesbian people, of indigenous populations, of farm workers. So all of those movement forces were out of that. And so in a similar way, I see movement forces coming out of this moment, but I won't get the benefit, you know, unless I live to be about 120, which I'll try to do. But
Please,
but if
please.
if I don't, you know, this, you know, that's why Zachariah had to offer the prophecy.
Right, that's right. So wait, why do you, I mean, so we have a lot of people in our congregation who are justice seekers, who, you know, are looking at, you know, less years going forward than they've already lived, you know. Why keep going?
Oh, no, this is, this, okay, now I have to be a therapist and a psychologist for a second.
You have to do all of it, I guess.
So the generative potential of being 50 and older is really about that. It's about seeding the next generation with all of the wisdom, knowledge, learning around justice that exists within us. So my major job, the one I care the most about, is being the director of the faculty of this urban fellowship program, because I get to work with 25 of the most powerful, intense, passionate young people who are ready to make this stuff happen, and they have no clue of who they are. They are absolutely traumatized by life experiences, and they have no boundaries around any of those kinds of things. And for me to sort of help them hold all of that is what I can do. That's what I can offer. I am not going to be walking down the 5 with them, you know, and, you know, taking tear gas. I can't do that, but I can help them look inside to understand where that's coming from in them, for them to develop a clearer language about what their strategies are, for them to develop networks of coalition with one another, to do the sort of basic and fundamental things around organizing, to have the benefits of what was learned from civil rights movement, from gay liberation movements, from women's liberation movements, from the farm workers movement, so that those things can be brought into this moment. That I can give. And, you know, and to the degree that I have cash, I don't have a lot, but at least, you know, the $50 here, $100 there that I'm able to give them, and I mean literally, that makes all the difference in the world for them to be able to stay where they are and do what they do, and then lead others and communicate that to others. So that has this cascade effect out. And that's the beautiful thing that I get to do right now, you know. So it's like Moses, you know, he didn't get to see it, but, you know, he got to sort of provide the way, you know.
That's right. I
And
love
so
that. You are such a preacher. You were like calling in all these scriptures. Look at you. That's amazing. Hey, do you have a favorite scripture?
I used to like 139th Psalm a lot.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, that's going to be our reading then for this Sunday. So get ready.
Thank you.
Hey, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
I'm
Right.
so grateful that the universe brought us together, and I can't wait to talk again. Thank you for being
Well,
you.
I have a great mentor, you know, right?
Including that in the service. Okay. All my love. I'll talk to you soon, okay?
I know.
Bye.